Good morning and welcome to ASL's HR in 10.
At 10.
I'm Jason Perry.
And I'm Kimberly Bradshaw.
And we get together on Thursday mornings to talk about what's going on in the world of HR. It's been a little while, hasn't it?
Yes, for a dull moment. Sorry?
I apologise for our gap through the summer. We've had one or two issues and we've not been here on a Thursday morning as much as we'd like. But we're back and we thought we'd talk about a really interesting story we've both been looking at, which is the police. It's a couple of weeks old now, but I remember driving along in my car one morning, listening to this headline on the news, and it said something like, they have decided to fire police officers for gross misconduct in future.
Yes, which begs the question, why have they not been doing so already?
Well, yes, my kind of reaction was almost disbelief. We have this standard offence in employment terms we call gross misconduct, which is anything that is really serious, and we could list the type of things, but simple examples: theft, bringing the organisation into disrepute, certain acts of violence, criminal offences,
harassment.
Yeah, but there's very clear things that will qualify as gross misconduct, and you define them in your contract of employment as gross misconduct because you think they're beyond the pale, they're not forgivable.
And that gives you the automatic right to dismiss without notice.
Yes. And this kind of begs the question. Many of us in the private sector have looked at the public sector for many years and kind of wondered, is it harder to fire people in the public sector?
Well, I think because they're such enormous organisations, it's very hard to, perhaps be as nimble in reacting to changes to employment law, perhaps. I don't know.
Well, I get that, but gross misconduct isn't new.
No.
So something has happened, and I look at it again. I say slightly in disbelief, but presumably, if an allegation is reported, there is something akin to an HR department that has investigated an allegation and reached a conclusion. But as best as I can tell, it appears that the conclusion was always, well, that's a bit naughty, don't do it again. And maybe they move somebody, maybe they demote somebody, but seemingly dismissals never happened, is what seems to have come out of this, doesn't it?
Yes, which is very bizarre because, a standard disciplinary policy would have, this is what's happened. You have to quickly do an investigation and you have to quickly come to a conclusion. Yes. And off you go. Yeah. And so why isn't that happening? Or rather, I know that they had independent lawyers doing this process, but,
That's also odd.
It is, isn't it? Because
yes.
You can do it internally. It doesn't have to be a massive time commitment.
No. The only time you might want to go independent in a disciplinary process is on an appeal.
Exactly.
The whole purpose of that is your balance and cross-check. So you can run an investigation yourself as the employer. You can reach conclusions. You and I tell employers so often that it's vital they don't predetermine the outcome. They don't go in with a prejudiced mindset. Yep. They openly investigate and they reach a balanced and logical conclusion.
Based on evidence.
Yes, based on evidence. You then have, in employment terms, the right of appeal and the simple basis that somebody else can look at it and go, did you investigate that fairly, properly, appropriately, and consider all the facts in the way that you should have done? And that, I might argue, is where the independence should sit.
Yes, although it doesn't have to be an external body.
No, it doesn't.
Because as long as it's somebody independent of the original investigation, and in an entity the size of the police, they must have hundreds of people able to do.
The reality is most small private employers manage this. So a bigger organisation should only have greater choice. I think part of the problem that's come out here, and I try and avoid politics with a big P, but I'm going to say is politics, perhaps with a small p. And I think what's happening is because it is a public sector organisation and it's political, people are worrying about whether or not what they're doing is right. And perhaps that's introduced an element of nerves. I don't necessarily see the police as, I'm going to say, a highly unionised environment, but perhaps there's also their equivalent of the union, which is exerting political pressure there. But there's another really interesting thing that's come out of this story in my mind. Reading it this morning, dismissals on gross misconduct are significantly up this year. Investigations are massively up this year. And more interesting, the number of allegations is massively up. Now, my mind simply says, are allegations up because more police are doing bad things? Or are allegations up because actually people within the force have realised that they are now being investigated and dealt with properly? And I think it's more likely the latter.
Yes, I think, you could be right. It's very difficult to identify, but well, I would love to get my hands on their policies and contracts to have a
Yes.
run through those and see what they say.
Yes.
Because it might well be that they do have all the sort of what we would in the private sector call normal policies and contract templates, but customer
No one's
practice,
enforcing them?
yeah, exactly. And custom and practice has evolved, which, you and I were talking earlier about the potential for tribunals, because some people will have, because of custom and practice or having set precedents, people will have assumed that it's acceptable.
Yes. And they can do bad things and keep their job, and they may use precedents of cases where that's happened in a tribunal. Yeah, I'd like to hope a tribunal would not find in their favour in such circumstances, but it's a real risk, I think, ahead as we try and balance the culture. What is most shocking to me is, and it's not like it's one police force, is it? This is all of our police forces. But there is the question of who was asleep at the helm and didn't see this happening. Because presumably, again, you and I would expect there to be an HR director on a board or so on. But somebody somewhere at the top of the organisation that was ultimately responsible for best practice in employment procedures was asleep on the job.
Yes.
I love the way you just say nod, as if there's nothing further to say on that.
I'm really quite speechless, which, as you know, is very rare for me. It is very bizarre. And, what I was also contemplating then was the fact that if people go through a vetting process, they should be dismissed automatically if there's an issue.
Yes.
Which also wasn't happening.
Yeah, so far we've only talked about the gross misconduct issue. But you're absolutely right, there's that other part of it. When you and I make an employment offer, it's conditional on satisfactory references. Yeah. And if a reference comes back with substantial detrimental information, or they don't clear a vetting procedure that you have in place, you wouldn't continue to hold that employment offer open. Yeah. You take the view, we now know of something that makes you unemployable to us.
Exactly. Little clause saying, your employment is based on passing the following.
Yes. Clean criminal record, maybe.
Yeah. Very helpful in the police force, that one.
Well, again, there are so many private sector employers that would draw a line at that. But the idea that I was about to say law enforcement agency, but I don't think we like to describe it as enforcement in the UK, do we? We police by consent. But you look at the loss of trust that has taken place, and you see how this culture has changed. And it's so difficult to understand how we have got here. We do appear to be coming out of it. It does appear that change has happened. But where I'm left wondering is almost how widespread this is in other public sector organisations. And do you know, we do as we often do when we talk about what we're going to talk about on HR in 10, try and come up with 2 or 3 subjects. And we've run out of time, not even having finished the first one.
I know, because I've got so much to say about the cost savings that they could make with all of this.
Perhaps we'll continue this one next week, Kimberly, but it's a fascinating one, and you've got the whole wider public sector stuff to talk about as well. But for now, HR in 10 is out of time, I'm afraid.
Dum, dum, dum.
So it's been lovely to return after our few-week break. We shall continue talking, perhaps on this subject, same time next week. Thanks for joining me, Kimberly. We'll see you soon.